My name is Chenua Flippin. I am a professor in the sociology department here at Penn and also the director of Penn's Center for the Study of Ethnicity, Race, and Immigration, or CERI. I'm very pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of today's event and will be doing the moderating. I want to, before we get started, thank all of our other co-sponsors and all of the people who helped put the event together. So thank you to Ann Kalbach from CERI. Thank you also to our co-sponsors, CLALS, the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies, thanks to Tulia Faletti, Kathy Barch, and Ana Jimenez from CLALS. Thank you to Emilio Parrado from the Population Studies Center, Roberto Gonzalez from the Penn Migration Initiative, and last but not least, also thank you to Krista Cortez from La Casa Latina. So I'm very pleased to see all of you here today with the start of Hispanic Heritage Month, and also all eyes riveted to the impending midterm elections. This seemed like the really perfect time to talk about Latinos, the role of Latinos in American politics. As many of you may be aware, the US Latino population has more than quadrupled in the last 40 years. So we're talking about something on the order of 62 million people, just under 19% of the total US population. And yet for many years, Latinos as a share of the electorate, particularly the voting population, has lagged quite a bit behind this national share, right? So a combination of the fact that many Latinos were non-citizen immigrants, coupled with the very young age profile of the Latino population, sort of undermined the immediacy with which the Latino population was felt in terms of elections, but that's something that we're really starting to see change today, right? So when I was looking up some statistics for today's event, I read somewhere that something like 900,000 Latinos turn 18 every year in the United States. So the share is only going to grow in the coming years. We've also seen a sharp uptick, not only in the registration rate among Latinos eligible to vote, but also an increase in voter participation. So the Latinos as a force in American politics is not going anywhere, something that we see every election cycle, both in the lead up and in the post-mortem of every American election. Geography is also really important when you think about the role of Latinos in US politics. So Latinos have long been influential due to their concentration in swing states like Florida. But with the continuous growth in the Latino population and also dispersion to new areas, we're also seeing Latinos figure prominently into potential swing states like Arizona and Georgia, as we saw in the past election. So I'm sure that many of you, like me, have been reading articles for years about how Latinos were going to turn Texas blue, or how Latinos nationally were going to spell doom for the Republican Party. And yet, as we all saw in the last couple of elections, Trump did, for some, what was very surprisingly well, right? So I believe he earned 28% of the Latino vote in 2016, and that rose by 4 percentage points in 2020. So a lot of people were caught off guard by that. No one at this table, I think. But it really shines a light on the fact that Latino party affiliation, Latino voting, is far from a foregone conclusion, right? So again, the time couldn't be better to try and situate these recent trends within the longer historical perspective and to ask broader questions about the future of Latino politics and how they're going to shape the broader electorate. So I couldn't be happier to introduce our speaker. I'm very happy to introduce Geraldo Cadava, who is an associate professor of history and Latina and Latino studies at Northwestern University. His research focuses on Latinos in the United States and the US-Mexico borderlands. In addition to numerous influential articles, he's also the author of 2 books. The first is Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2013, and won a number of prizes and awards, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Award by the Organization of American Historians. His latest book is what we're going to be hearing, or at least talking more about today, The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, which has also got a lot of positive attention and awards. It was named one of the 12 best books on Latinos in 2020 by NBC News. Professor Cadava is also very prolific in terms of public-facing writing and media appearances. He's emerged as one of the leading experts on Latino political attitudes and voting behavior. You might have seen his writing in places like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. I could go on many, many more. He's also appeared on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, something some of our younger audience members might appreciate. In addition to NBC News, MSNBC, Univision, again, many, many more. I was scrolling through the media link on his webpage, and it takes a long time to see all of his media appearances. So thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to have a brief introduction for Michael Jones-Correa, who will be providing some commentary and kicking off the discussion for us this afternoon. Michael Jones-Correa is the President's Distinguished Professor and current Chair of the Political Science Department here at Penn. He was also the founding director of SERI. He's the author of numerous books, including Holding Fast, Resilience and Civic Engagement Among Latino Immigrants in 2020, Latinos in the New Millennium in 2012, Latino Lives in America, Making It Home in 2010, Between Two Nations, The Political Predicament of Latinos in New York City in 1998. He's also edited 2 edited volumes on interethnic coalitions and immigrant political incorporation, as well as publishing innumerable articles and book chapters in those areas as well. Dr. Jones-Correa has also contributed to the creation of data, acting as the co-PI on the 2006 Latino National Survey, as well as the Latino Immigrant National Election Survey in 2012 and 2016. He's also served on the committee to redesign the US naturalization test for the National Academy of Sciences, was elected as vice president of the American Political Science Association in 2009, and has served on the boards of the American National Election Studies, and is the current chair of the Board of Trustees of the Russell Sage Foundation. So thank you very much to both of you for joining us. I'm going to hand the mic over to Professor Cadava. And again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you for joining me in conversation. And I just want to thank everyone who partook in bringing me here. It's really nice to be here. It's also nice to have my dad here, who drove over from New Jersey, and I'm going to talk about his dad, my grandfather, in just a minute. So thank you all for coming. I really wanted to be besties with Trevor Noah. I thought there was like a moment it might happen, but he hasn't called me since, so I'll just have to keep sitting by my phone, I guess. So, you know, I do want to talk a little bit about my book, The Hispanic Republican, but I want to only give you kind of the broadest overview of some of what I was up to and what my findings were before opening up the conversation, because I think for me and for you, the most interesting part will be, you know, when we are able to talk with one another. So what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to this topic. I'll tell you a little bit about the book itself, and then I'll tell you a little bit about where the conversation has gone for me and nationally, I think, since the publication of the book, since the 2020 election, because I think in a lot of ways the conversation has only become more interesting, and it certainly didn't end with the publication of the book or the 2020 election. I think all of us here know that for the past couple of years since the 2020 election, there has been a really kind of interesting conversation developing about Latinos. You know, I still am talking to media today about, you know, are Latinos trending Republican? Are they trending Democrat? And part of why I want to talk to you about how I came to the project is that I am increasingly frustrated with this idea that the only thing we need to figure out about Latinos is whether we are Republican or Democrat. And I didn't come to the project for those kind of, to answer that narrow partisan question. So how did I come to the project? I think I'm sure there are a million reasons I came to the project, but I will just talk about 2 of them. The first is that my grandfather is a Latino Republican, and he and I have argued about politics for many, many years. And I remember when I was in my early teens kind of having conversations with him. He loved watching Fox News, and I had a lot of conversations with him in the early 90s about border security, immigration, welfare, patriotism and loyalty, his own military service, which was really meaningful for him. And he told a story about how he became a Republican, voted for a Republican for the first time in 1980 when he was working at a copper mine in Arizona called Silver Bell, and he voted for Reagan, according to him, this is his story, for a very particular reason, that Reagan was promising to put more money back into his biweekly paychecks in the form of tax cuts. And then over the years, over the past 40 years, he has become a loyal Republican to the extent that when I asked him how he felt about Donald Trump in 2016, he said that Donald Trump is a good guy because he's a Republican. It wasn't attached to any sort of policy preference or anything. He was just a good guy because he's a Republican. And I think that says something about the growing partisanship that we're all witnessing around us right now. So I became interested in how one person could start voting for a Republican for a particular reason at one point, and then over the years would just become a truly loyal Republican, a loyal partisan. So for sure, part of this book has to do with me. It's in some ways an ongoing conversation with or argument even with my grandfather about Latino politics. The second reason, and I guess I kind of always wanted to understand the wider world that he was a part of. The second reason is that in my first book, Standing on Common Ground, which is about the Arizona-Sonora border since World War II, I wrote about a department store owner, a Mexican-American department store owner named Alejandro Jacome, who was close associates with Barry Goldwater, hated Cesar Chavez. He was a Marxist self-promoter. He didn't want his employees to unionize because he felt like he could take care of his employees as the kind of patron at the head of a Spanish mission or something. This is how he saw himself. And as a Mexican-American Republican in the 1950s and 1960s, he wasn't like anyone else I had read about in the field of Latino history. He also wasn't like anyone I had seen in an archive while doing research. So he also was not Cuban-American, to the extent that I knew anything about Latino conservatism. It was about the Cuban exile community in South Florida. So I had this, I guess I could say a little bit more about my grandfather, who is Colombian, Filipino, Panameño. My grandmother is Mexican-American. So my grandfather was a Colombian, Filipino, Panameño Republican living in the US-Mexico borderlands. And when we think about Tucson, it's primarily associated with Mexican-Americans. So there were all sorts of ways in which he felt like an anomaly to me, but I knew and suspected that there was a kind of deeper story there. So I think with these two things, my ongoing arguments with my grandfather and my first book, which in part was about this conservative department store owner, that's what led me to write about Latino conservatives, Latino Republicans. The reason I tell you this story is that I did not enter this subject. I did not come to this subject because I was trying to figure out who Latinos were as voters. And I think this brings a slightly different perspective to a lot of the conversations you hear today, because a lot of the people talking about Latino voters today are people like Chuck Rocha, who headed Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2020, or Daniel Garza, who is the head of the Libre Initiative, Koch-funded conservative initiative that's about preaching the prosperity gospel in some ways, the virtues of free enterprise, or people like Mike Madrid or what's her name, Maria Teresa Kumar. These are partisans. They don't call themselves progressives or conservatives when they're on media, when they're talking to reporters, but they are very much advocating for and representing a particular political viewpoint. And many of them are paid consultants who are trying to win elections. But when they talk to media, they're talking about who Latinos are broadly. And so I think there's a deeper story to tell that has nothing to do with Latino partisanship and whether Latinos are Republicans or Democrats. And I think that that's where I want to push the conversation as a historian. And the reason I became interested in Latino conservatism is it's more just about explaining what I saw to be an understudied, underappreciated facet of Latino identity more than trying to solve a political riddle. I wasn't trying to figure out how to get one party or another over the hump to win 51% of the electorate. I was, and still am, interested in explaining Latinos broadly. And I think that relates to part of how I feel about the conversation about Latino politics today. I think, if anything, there's a kind of overemphasis on Latinos as voters and with less of an understanding of Latino history and all of the twists and turns and complications in Latino history that have led to this, very diverse conversation that we're having today about Latino politics. So I wrote a book called The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump. And just to give you a really brief sketch of that book, it has 4 parts called Becoming, Inclusion, or Becoming Republican, I think, Inclusion, Power, and Loyalty. And that's, each of those sections basically reflects what I see as different periods within the past 50 years where Latino voters are changing, where the Republican Party's approach to Latinos is changing. The first section, Becoming Republican, is about the 50s and 60s when both parties were beginning to make a concerted effort to reach out to Latino voters for different reasons. One was that the electoral map was shifting. So in 1950, the greatest number of electoral votes was in New York. By 1960, that had started to shift because of the Sun Belt boom. So places like Florida and Texas and California were increasingly important electorally by 1960. They had more people, they had more money, there were great migrations to the Sun Belt. And so these are also the areas of the country where most Latinos lived, Mexican Americans. Cubans were in Florida, but by the 1960s, they hadn't begun to naturalize in great numbers. They were still kind of engaged primarily with the politics of the island and thinking about how to overthrow Fidel Castro, something they thought about for several decades since. So they didn't really start to naturalize until the mid to late 1970s. So they're part of the story, but not the entire story. I think that's interesting for our conversation and understanding about Latino politics today, to recognize that the beginning of the Latino conservative movement really had to do with Mexican Americans in the Southwest, in places like Texas and California, and not the Cuban exile community in the Southeast. And I remember doing a lot of interviews with Mexican American Republicans who were almost like frustrated that the whole story was about Cuban Americans, because they said, as they put it, Cuban Americans didn't really matter until 1980, when Reagan kind of brought them more into the party. So I got ahead of myself a little bit, because in the 1950s and 1960s, it's this period when both parties are beginning to make inroads with Latino communities. And Latino conservatives themselves, the way that they went about trying to convince other Latinos to become Republicans was by saying things like, you have been blindly loyal to the Democratic Party ever since the years of FDR, because Franklin Roosevelt had, during the Depression, helped put food on the table, helped get you jobs. But really, if you think about it, what have you gotten for that loyalty? They come around every 4 years looking for your votes, and then they forget about you until the next election. I'm sure for many of you, that idea still sounds very familiar, the negligence of the Democratic Party, the taking for granted of Latinos by the Democratic Party. So that's kind of been a through line in the story for the past 50 or 60 years, 70 years. So that was the argument for why Latinos should become Republicans. But at the same time, you had Cold War presidents like Dwight Eisenhower, who were important figures during World War II. Many Latinos served in World War II, so they were drawn to a kind of military president, given their own military experience. So a lot of the rhetoric in the 1950s and 60s also had to do with anti-communism and all of the contrasts between the Soviet Union and the United States as the kind of defender of liberty and freedom and democracy around the world. That was the argument. this is what I talk about in the first section, becoming Republican. In the next section, inclusion, this is the period when, it covers basically the late 1960s and the 1970s, when Richard Nixon's campaign, for a whole host of reasons, really commits to reaching out to Latinos. He hires an advisor named Stuart Spencer in Southern California, who had also managed his 1960 presidential campaign where he lost to JFK. But, this guy, Stuart Spencer in Southern California, came up with ideas like opening community centers in East LA that would not just be kind of election places or voter registration places, but also health clinics and immigration clinics and places where you could go, they could organize job fairs. In other words, it was about developing a relationship with a community, even during off years when there wasn't an election, in order to kind of cultivate their loyalty that way. The other thing Nixon did, which I think is really interesting, he developed these ideas about Black capitalism and brown capitalism. And he talked about, creating business opportunities for Mexican Americans. And he created something called the National Economic Development Association, which was about helping Latinos kind of start their own banks, savings or thrift banks. And he called capitalist development the third plank of the civil rights movement, I think, that didn't get as much attention as the social and political protests in the streets, but were every bit as important to uplifting Latinos and Latinos getting ahead. So I think kind of capitalism and Latino business ownership was really important. He also was the first president to take this important, highly symbolic move of appointing the first US Treasurer of the United States, a Mexican-American woman from East Los Angeles named Romana Acosta Bañuelos, who had started a bank, who had started her own tortilla factory, which still exists. I don't know if any of you are from Southern California, but it's called Ramona's Mexican Food Products. You guys know it. That's awesome. So it's still like the biggest Mexican food distributor in Southern California. Her name was Romana. It's called Ramona's because she thought that Americans would have a hard time pronouncing Romana, so she called it Ramona's. And the first dollar bills that she signed after she was appointed are still kind of hanging in the main office of Ramona's Mexican Food Products. So she was the first Hispanic treasurer of the United States. It's kind of become a tradition for the Republican Party to appoint Hispanic treasurers of the United States. And they signed all of the American currency in circulation for much of the 1970s and 1980s. So this is why it's about inclusion. It's about bringing Latinos not only into the Republican Party as voters, but in these leadership positions. The other thing that happened in the 70s was the RNC created an auxiliary group called the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, which has actually revived over the past couple of years, but it kind of became a bullpen for Republican presidential administrations to appoint Latinos into their administration. So that was what happened in the 1970s. The next section is about power, and I'll try to do this very quickly, but the main shift, I think, during the Reagan years was twofold. It was about, as we know from lots of American history classes, that Reagan had this whole idea about like colorblind conservatism. He wasn't going to cater to any particular ethnic group. Instead, he was going to make appeals to them based on ideological conservatism, religion, capitalism, anti-communism. And it really was Reagan that kind of formed relationships with Jorge Mascanosa and the Cuban American National Foundation in Florida. And, he prosecuted the Contra War in Central America. And it's amazing, going to the Reagan archives, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters from Central Americans really supporting the Contras, really saying, thank you for the work you're doing down here. And there were letters, I remember, in the archives of the New Mexican Senator Manuel Lujan, a Republican senator, where his constituents in New Mexico were writing to him, really supporting the Contra War and wanting to fight the Sandinistas. And I think that kind of runs contrary to a lot of our assumptions about Latino history in the 80s. So, Reagan was quite popular among Latinos. And then the important thing that happens in the 90s is that the Republican Party takes a really dramatic anti-immigrant shift. And in 1992, there's a Republican primary campaign between George H.W. Bush and Patrick Buchanan. And Patrick Buchanan wins 37% of the primary vote in 1992, which means that he's able to push George H.W. Bush to the right. And Buchanan, through his lobbying, got part of the Republican platform to say, we support the construction of structures along the US-Mexico border, which, that was kind of the first call to build the wall. Reagan didn't support building a border wall. In fact, with the president of Mexico, he said, we don't need a 9-foot fence between our two countries. Mexico is our most important ally. Today, it's not a 9-foot fence, it's a 30-foot fence. So things have changed, but that was the kind of the first build the wall. And then we know about Proposition 187 and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act in 1996. And what this does is it just kind of opens up a debate among Latino Republicans. How can we continue to be loyal to this party that so obviously is not interested in, immigration in particular? And for much of the 90s and early 2000s, it was still the theory that the best way for the Republican Party to recruit Latinos was to pass comprehensive immigration reform. That was largely why George W. Bush was successful among Latinos, because he and President Vicente Fox in Mexico had worked. The story goes that the week before 9/11, they were working together on a comprehensive immigration reform bill. 9/11 happened, that shuts down all conversation about immigration reform. And in fact, the United States continues this rightward shift on immigration and, debates the Secure Fence Act. And then, of course, it becomes much more about, you had people like Rick Perry, the governor of Texas, talking about fears that Muslim terrorists were bringing missiles across the US-Mexico border, and that became the justification for immigrant exclusion, really, since 9/11. I mean, maybe we're still in that period in a lot of ways. So the last section is called loyalty, because you have, despite the changes in the Republican Party, you have a cohort of Latino conservatives who are still rationalizing their support for the Republican Party, even though the Republican Party has taken a hard right turn on immigration. They are people like my grandfather who, says that they are Republican, that these candidates are good people because they're Republicans. It's kind of a blind loyalty. But I did also talk to a lot of Latino conservatives who over the past several years they're really kind of questioning their loyalty, and they're wondering how long they can continue to be loyal to the Republican Party. And given what the Republican Party has become. Interestingly, I didn't write about this so much in the book. It was actually the kind of older Latino conservatives, those who came into the Republican Party in the 1970s, 1980s, when the Republican Party was very different, who had a much harder time being able to had a harder time supporting the Republican Party today, given how it changed. Famously, there was an advertising executive named Leonel Sosa from San Antonio who had worked on both Reagan campaigns, who publicly denounced the Republican Party in 2016. He wrote an op-ed in his hometown paper, the San Antonio Express News, saying he could no longer be a Republican because Donald Trump is not a conservative, he's a charlatan, all of these things. So it's actually the older Latino conservatives who I've heard wrestle more with continuing to be Republicans today, which makes the fact that Trump expanded his support in 2020 particularly interesting, because it does mean that, I don't think this has really been studied, but it does mean that he also activated new Republican voters, youth also. There's a guy named Abraham Enriquez in South Texas who started a group called Bienvenido US. It's affiliated with Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA. He's 23, 24, a recent college grad, and he's kind of out championing the cause of Latino conservatism. So I think, younger Latino conservatives is something that requires much more attention. So I'm going to skip the section about interesting characters I came across. We can talk about that later. But I'll just leave off by saying a couple things about topics that still should be covered, things I didn't get to. I think in some ways, looking back on it now, my book was, and maybe only could have been an introduction to this topic. I mean, it was the first kind of overview of Latino conservatism over the past 50 years historically. And, you know, I was much more interested in the Republican Party nationally and how it was reaching out to Latinos and how Latinos were also moving toward the Republican Party nationally, which means there's a lot more to study about particular places like Houston or Los Angeles or Chicago or anywhere else, everywhere across the map. There's a lot more to do with particular places. There's a lot more to do with particular subjects like evangelicalism, of course, but also military service, also charter schools and school choice. That's been really important for Latino conservatives. So these are directions that, you know, I didn't really cover all that much. I also think race is a topic that needs to be explored much more. I've thought about this. I have some reasons why I didn't emphasize race, perhaps not good reasons. One is that, you know, a lot of the book relied on oral histories, and you never have Latino conservatives telling you that they are Republicans because they aspire to be white, or they have ideas about anti-Blackness, or ideas about anti-indigeneity, or they kind of distance themselves from their indigenous roots. You don't have Latino conservatives saying that, and so this is a methodological problem. I mean, I wanted at some level to take seriously what people were telling me about their own experiences and how they saw the world that they were living in. But I do think that I could have been more critical about their ideas about race. And so I think, you know, anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity and indigenous Latinos, Afro-Latinos, these are topics we're all thinking and talking about a lot more, and I could have been more explicit about that. And I think that, you know, any of you thinking about dissertations or undergraduate theses, these would be good things to explore. So, and then finally, you know, and this is where I think I'm moving away from my last book towards new territory, for me at least. I have grown increasingly frustrated by having the same conversation with reporters over the past 2 years who only want to know, is the shift we saw in 2020 real? Is it lasting? Did it happen? What does it mean? And to me, that is just another way of only continuing to care about Latinos to the extent that they can shape American elections. And I think that we need to have a deeper and earlier, prior conversation about the whole run of Latino history to understand how these various threads have come together, not necessarily to lead to a merger or simple understanding of Latino history, but to understand where all of the threads have gone and where they came from. So I think it's almost an earlier conversation that we need to have about Latino history that helps explain Latino history, identity, culture, politics, that then can help us understand Latino voters. So I'll end there. I'm sure I went longer than, oh my goodness, I'm sorry, I went much longer than my 20 minutes. I apologize, but here we are.
Great, thank you. Right, thank you. I so enjoy these kinds of talks and listening, in particular today, because one of the things that history does for us is it should make us less surprised.
Yes.
When something like the 2020 elections happen. And I think so I have many of the same conversations with media people, and their focus is so narrow and so presentist. And it's if Latino conservatives just sort of appeared and never existed before, and all of a sudden, like, wow, there are these people in South Texas who are conservative. Like, who knew? So getting the story of how this has been around, it's always been around, there have always been Latino conservatives. You know, in political science, we look to survey data or voting data, and further back you go, if you're going back to the 60s and 70s, polling data on Latinos is really thin, often not that great, but there's a consistency to the polling going from the late 60s pretty much to the present day, which is there have been always, if you look at the vote breakdown for Latinos in the United States, about 1/3 have been Republican, going back to the late 1960s. This is not new. It's very consistent, about 1/3. We think of Latinos as being Democratic voters, and yeah, they kind of are, not as democratic as African Americans, you know, more progressive than, say, non-Hispanic whites, but there's 1/3 of Latinos who have consistently, in every poll, every survey, identify as being conservative, voting Republican. So 2020 shouldn't have been that much of a surprise, but apparently it is. This kind of historical work gives a kind of richness to the kind of very thin story, the narrative that the polling data gives us. The other part of 2020 is when reporters ask about 2020, they're always comparing it to 2016. And so the idea is like, you know, more Latinos voted in 2020 for Republicans than in 2016, and that is also a surprise to them. So why is that a surprise? There are two ways of looking at this. One way is that Donald Trump was a very used anti-immigrant rhetoric, and people feel like should have driven Latinos away from the Republican Party and didn't. Instead, Latino voters felt more comfortable voting for Donald Trump in 2020 than in 2016. So which is the outlier? Is it 2016 or 2020? And I would actually argue that 2016 was the outlier. 2016, a lot of Latino voters were afraid of Donald Trump, either stayed at home, voted against him, and 2020 was more a return to the mean. So if you look at the voting data, it returns back to this 2/3, 1/3 split, where about 1/3 of Latino voters are voting Republican, despite Trump being the president that he was. So I have some questions.
Yeah,
Several questions. Well, one question I reached out earlier to ask what were my thoughts. So one puzzle for me that's been puzzling me for a while is, so this 2/3, 1/3 split, which we've had now for 50 years, even as you've had these enormous changes, like the Latino population in 2020 is not the Latino population of the 1960s. Sorry, yeah, not the same population. So the Latino population in the US becomes much more immigrant, much more diverse in lots of ways. So this concentration in South Texas and California, Florida becomes national. There are Latinos everywhere and become a much greater proportion of the population. So all through this period of from, again, 1960s to the present, even though you have this 2-to-1 split, even though pundits can say Latinos are Democratic voters, in fact, there's all these changes beneath the surface, geographically, demographically, immigrants and native-born. I mean, there's huge changes occurring during this period, and so I will ask you about this, and because you had an additional observation, which I think was also quite insightful. So I'm just going to pass this to you. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, you've said a lot. I mean, about numbers, counting Latinos, about consistency over time, and I don't have a clear answer to the consistency question, but I have ideas and questions of my own that relate to it. I mean, and these, I think, all the things I think we're saying, these would all be good topics to study more for papers, dissertations, all this stuff. But one idea I don't know, one cynical interpretation would be that the parties have always known exactly how much of the Latino vote they need to win in order to win elections. And so they're going for, on the margins, trying to squeeze out 2 or 3 more percent here, 2 or 3 more percent in this area. So maybe part of the reason for consistency is that the parties are only, they're so micro-targeting particular parts of the electorate that they are kind of always targeting this consistent percentage. I don't think that's particularly right. I don't know. Maybe that's one theory, but it's true. There's so much going on. I mean, you have the Cuban story. You have the rising immigration of Central Americans in the 1970s and 1980s. You have a changing Republican Party that pretends to be very inclusive in the 70s and 80s and bringing Latinos into the kind of power structures of the party, and then in the 1990s rejecting them. Yet, it's one thing that's amazing to me is Proposition 187. There's such an idea about California that killed any chance that the Republican Party had of winning Latino votes. And it is true that before 1992, Reagan, for example, or George H.W. Bush, Republicans were much more likely to win 35, 37% of the Latino vote. And that did dip after 1994, but to this day, after Proposition 187, somewhere between 24, 25% of Latinos in California, which has the greatest population of Latino voters in the whole country, continues to vote for Republicans. So it dipped, but it didn't kill the Republican Party in California. And I'm not going to go through the math, but there are more Latinos in California who voted for Republicans than in Florida, just given the size of the Latino population, the number of eligible voters. But if you kind of crank out the numbers and do percentages and size of populations, more Latino voters in California voted for Republicans, which is a surprising fact, I think, because we tend to think of California as the more liberal state, and the Latino population there is more liberal. So, I think, I'm not answering your question. I don't know why there is this consistency. It is strange. I mean, you take things like the statehood party in Puerto Rico too, the PNP, we know that Puerto Ricans themselves cannot vote for presidents in the general election, but they can participate in the primary process. And conservative Puerto Ricans on the island also very much pressure their Puerto Rican acquaintances, family members, and even legislatures in like Florida and New York to advocate for their positions on statehood or any number of issues. And the politics of that movement changes also over the past 40 or 50 years. So it kind of is an interesting thing that despite the last thing I will say about the consistency, it's interesting, because the American electorate is also different in every election too, right? I mean, who is galvanized in a particular election changes a lot over time. It seems over the past couple of months that abortion has been a really important issue for a lot of Americans, and that's going to really shape who the electorate is in November. And that changes all the time. I mean, those voters who were really, really galvanized by abortion, I'm not saying they didn't vote in 2016 or 2020, but what the kind of central issue is in any given election changes. So you would think that as the issues change, as the communities change, that the percentages would fluctuate a little more than they do, Do you have any other ideas about this?
I mean, that there's a lot of change happening below the surface.
Yeah.
So you have South Florida, super interesting. It's a super interesting Latino community. There was a while in the late 90s, early 2000s, when what I was hearing from friends who were doing polling in South Florida was South Florida is going to keep trending Democratic because second-generation Cuban Americans are moving away from the Republican Party and becoming Democrats. But then you have a countervailing trend, which is the influx of new immigrants from other parts of Latin America who are more conservative, who become voters, who become citizens. And it cancels out the movement toward the Democratic Party among younger Cuban American voters. Again, I don't know that you're going to find a sort of explanation for why the 2-to-1 is so consistent, but the 2-to-1 consistency means that people can look at Latinos and see them as not complicated, because they've always been this way. You know, it's always this way. It's unchanging, but it's always changing. It's just changing beneath the surface.
Yeah.
You said something I will say in your reply to my initial one, which was that the Republican Party has changed a lot too, and the Democratic Party. Like they've changed a lot since the 1960s, and yet this is a period not of consistency. It's a period of radical change, both demographically and in the institutions that are receiving immigrants, receiving new voters.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. I mean, I think that, historians are obsessed with ideas of continuity and change, and I can look at the past 50 years and see a lot of continuity and a lot of change. I mean, the Republican Party strategy with Latinos has also shifted a lot, but it hasn't shifted a lot. I mean, issues have come and gone, but some things have stayed consistent. So I would say, like, since the 1950s, anti-communism has been a pretty consistent thread among Latino conservatives. But I would also say that what anti-communism has meant has changed over time and has varied from community to community. I mean, I think there's a lot of attention today about, you know, the attacks of socialism in South Florida and how effective those seem to have been. And that also kind of, for many people, confirms how this Cuban exile story is really a core component of what it means to be a Latino conservative. But when I was doing all of my research for this book, every Latino community, Puerto Ricans, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, all had their own version of anti-communism. So the Puerto Rican nationalists, for example, like Pedro Albizu Campos or Lolita Lebron, who shot up Congress in 1954, they were kind of red-baited as communists. And the Puerto Ricans on the island who were members of the Partido Nuevo Progresista, someone like Luis Ferré or today Zoraida Fonalledas, they all talk about the kind of socialism of the Puerto Rican independence movement. They point to the Young Lords, things like that too. Same thing with Mexican Americans whose families came in the 1920s during the Cristero Wars. And the Cristeros, you know, this is a kind of religious war in Mexico and a revolt against the 1917 Constitution that stripped Catholics of their influence in Mexico, expropriated property. And so many of the Cristeros who immigrated to the United States in the 1920s look at the 1917 Constitution as a Marxist-inspired document. And that idea, true or not, you know, has filtered through the generations. So it's, I would say that you can't just look at, you know, Latinos and say that the anti-communist, anti-socialist Latinos are only those who have come from Venezuela or come from Cuba in recent years. It really kind of, it's an idea among Latino conservatives that cuts across groups and cuts across the country. And so I think this is just one of the ways that we need to kind of deepen our understanding of Latino politics by having a closer look at Latino history and thinking about all of these counter narratives like various reactions to the territorial status of Puerto Rico or the Mexican Revolution that Latino conservatives have very different viewpoints about than what we tend to think of. Went a little bit in a direction that,
yeah. Are we?
I mean, I think that if you're okay with it, I think we can open the.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
We're going to pass the mic down. I'm going to give a quick check to see if anybody is.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
I have one basic small question.
Sure.
And then another one that I would
You
like
know that means it's a big question. That's going to be hard. It's how it usually works.
One is a question of origins, and Professor alluded to the diversification. Is it the case that when a Latin American becomes a citizen, a little bit like me, although I'm not, then Latino or not? Because the origins make a tremendous difference. That's a small question. It's just a question of definition. But the other question that I would like you to discuss is that I think I have to take a provocative stance. You cannot call the Republican Party today a conservative party, like you could not call Mussolini's movement in Italy a conservative movement. This is a radical party, and is that perceived by Latino Republicans? The last question is that you did not mention abortion. Finding political work that it's important. And I asked 3 times.
Oh, that's okay. No, they're all good questions. I mean, the identity question, we could go on forever about this. And I think, you know, some recent arrivals find themselves in the United States and confused about why all of a sudden they're seen to be Latinos. I think that's one answer. I think another answer is that some recent arrivals become politicized once they arrive in the United States and become more involved in Latino politics. You know, I guess this helps to illustrate this more concretely through examples. I remember talking to the head of the Republican Party in El Paso, who told me that before the pandemic, he personally would go to all of the naturalization ceremonies in El Paso to hand out literature about what the Republican Party stood for. And that, to me, suggests that the Republican Party hasn't given up on kind of shaping the political views of recent immigrants. And I think evangelical churches are much like this, too, because at the same time that evangelicalism is growing in the United States, it's also growing in Latin America. And so many Latin American migrants who are evangelicals, their first point of contact in the United States is evangelical churches here, and they become politicized through those kinds of affiliations. One guy, Alfonso Aguilar, who headed the Catholics for Trump organization, he told me that his theory is that the Democratic Party just fundamentally misunderstands the ambitions and desires of immigrants, because Latino or Latin American migrants come to the United States not to be lumped together with other Latinos as Latinos, but they come to the United States to, you know, get jobs, provide better educations for their children than they themselves had, so that they can have opportunities. So I think that, you know, all of this gets at the identity question a little bit, of how Latin American migrants become politicized in the United States. It is a radical party. I think one thing and it has changed, but what's been interesting to me is to hear Latino conservatives rationalize why they've continued to stick with the Republican Party. One answer is that it's the Democrats. We've become increasingly radical. So, you know, there's an old line about how, like, I didn't leave the party left me. And so Democrats have moved too far to the left, which gives them no other choice but to support Republicans. But also, political scientists talk a lot about, you can confirm this maybe, but talk a lot about permission structures that Donald Trump enabled, you know, that there's a kind of coming out of Latino conservatives, or Latinos who've always been conservative but are now fully confident in embracing their conservatism. And this kind of echoes what some Latino conservatives have told me, is that finally someone like Donald Trump has allowed them to embrace their true ideological conservatism. They've even talked about George W. Bush. George W. Bush had 150 Latinos in his administration. There's a picture of them all standing the week before 9/11, all of them standing from wall to wall in front of the White House. It was like a big deal because there were so many Latinos in the Bush administration. And some of the same people who worked in the Bush administration now talk about George W. Bush's policies as Republican light, because he was going after Latinos. He was kind of basically kowtowing to the Democratic theory, which was that through passing comprehensive immigration reform, that's how they were going to reach out to Latinos. But what they like about Trump, they actually see Trump more as a return to Ronald Reagan, who embraced true ideological conservatism and appealed to Latinos not as members of various ethnic groups, although Trump certainly did that, but as a true ideological conservative. they can truly kind of embrace their conservative values. And so they've kind of moved along with the Republican Party. I actually don't think they consider themselves to be radicals, because I remember like a month ago, there was an article in the New York Times about the rise of the far-right Latina. It was about these three candidates, Mexican-American candidates in South Texas running as Republicans, and they really objected to the characterization of these three women as far-right. And their point was like, why do they have to be far-right instead of just conservatives? They're just conservatives. So they took issue with that. So I don't think they think that they are becoming more radical. I think that they see themselves as just conservatives. I don't agree with that, but I mean, this is what's hard this is what I wrestled with as a historian, how much to listen to what they say and take that seriously and at least present the way that they see themselves, in addition to kind of imposing my own views as a historian and being critical of their views and calling them something like far right if that's not how they saw themselves, you know. But,
so picking up on the, you mentioned the Latina conversation.
yeah.
We have a question in the chat that asks you to describe any efforts by the Democratic and Republican Party promoting Latinas in particular. And how do Latina migrants become politicized?
How do Latina migrants become politicized? I think that this is something that's interesting as a difference between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, I think, at least how they describe themselves. Many describe the Democratic Party as the party that plays quote unquote identity politics by targeting members of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And the Republican Party likes to think of itself as a party that doesn't target particular ethnic and racial backgrounds because they're just all Americans. Like you have Latinos in the 1950s and 60s saying like, I'm not a hyphenated American who's Mexican American or Puerto Rican American. I am an American of Mexican descent. So Republicans like to talk about how they have just a much broader appeal to Latinos as Americans, and they don't need to distinguish between countries. That said, Republicans play identity politics all the time, but it's a different kind of identity, and this relates to the gender question because I think they appeal to, I don't know if it's that much different than their appeal to women in general, but it has to do with traditional family values, valuing women as homemakers. It has to do with, pro-life positions. And, I'll point to the example of a woman, of the treasurer I was talking about, Romana Acosta Bañuelos, who Nixon appointed as the first US treasurer. It's super interesting because she was appointed in 1972. She's from East Los Angeles. She had started fellowship programs at UCLA for Mexican-American students, but they were not Chicano fellowships. They were just Mexican-American fellowships, and they were given to Mexican-Americans who were going to go into business because they were interested in going into business. She married but never had children. She was Mexican-American during the Chicano movement, but she was very much against the Chicano movement and its activists. Or the next one was a woman named Catherine Ortega who served under Ronald Reagan. And her story, she was the first Latina to give a keynote speech at the Republican National Convention in 1984. And her whole story was about how she was born a Republican because she had learned about traditional family values and kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, go get 'em business ethics from her father. So she had learned all of conservative values at the knees of her father. That's what she said. So I think the Republican Party's approach to recruiting Latina women has to do with business ownership. I mean, the fastest growing group of small business owners in the United States isn't just Latinos, it's Latinas. And so the Trump administration talked a lot about how it gave small business loans, slashed financial regulations that made it easier for Latinas to open their businesses. It's a kind of traditional pro-family, marriage is between men and women kind of thing, that's how they appeal to Latinas. It's interesting that, the kind of three highest profile candidates in Texas are these women. I think on the one hand, what that's about is they just carve a very different figure than Donald Trump. So from the Republican Party's perspective, what's appealing about these women is that they can pronounce the same policy positions as Donald Trump, but with a much different visual presentation. And I don't know if you want to call it a softer, kinder Donald Trump. I don't think that's the case, but they are people from the community, so they can, I guess, be more trusted as insiders rather than outsiders.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. Just wanted to go, I'm trying to figure out how to say this coherently, because there's a lot of points that I want to talk. So I've been sitting here wondering what's the framework in terms of the usage of the word Latino politics in American politics. It sounds from the history recorded in your book that the Republican Party is functioning as an organization in terms of recruitment, in terms of putting out candidates. It's doing its job as a party. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we should, it is an alarming thing to have more Latinx people become involved in Republican politics. But given all that, I'm curious about the way that you went about your research and your book, and then came out thinking, or trying to avoid the whole, and it's cliche or blase, whichever you want to prefer, the saying or the phrase, the Latinos are not a monolith, right? And sort of that thing. How did you try to sort of, I guess what I'm trying to say is, who were you writing to in terms of, oh, these are Latino Republicans? And I want to highlight that in terms of you're trying to deviate from the way the media presents them, or you're trying to highlight something with regards to the way party politics actually affect Latinos, because we actually had Obama known as the deporter in chief, so this, so there's not a weird sort of insidious thing that's happening. It's a reaction to politics. So my one question is, how did you, in your research, how did you go away with continuing to use Latinos, right? Because you talked about how California is the most Latinx population, but the Latino population in California is much different than the one in New York. Is it, and the big question here, and I hope I don't shut things down, but how useful is this Latino designation as a political identity?
Yeah, it's a good question. Some people have asked me, for someone who is trying to break down our understanding of Latinos as a group, I assured you, talk about Latinos a lot. So is there a tension there? And there is a tension there, but what the simplest thing I'll try to say is that I don't think there is such a thing as the Latino bloc, but I do think that there are 60 million Americans for whom thinking of themselves as Latino, whatever that means to them, is an important part of their identity. So there are 60 million people out there who consider themselves Latinos, not necessarily in relation to one another, maybe in relation to one another, but it's an important part of their self-conception. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I also think that, for me, one thing I've thought about a lot is just the basis of Latino identity. One thing I think about Latino identity is that in some ways its very essence is just the ongoing argument about what it means to be Latino. If there's anything that defines Latinidad, it's about arguing about what their Latinidad means, what their identity means, whether they're part of a group, whether they're individuals. In the Latino history class I teach at Northwestern, the first lecture is about who or what is a Latino anyway, and the goal isn't to answer that question. It's just a question that kind of we carry through with us. The politics of my politics in this conversation, who I'm trying to write for, that's an interesting question that I wrestle with a lot. In some ways, I feel like I have been starting arguments with people that I agree with my allies on the left in some ways, because I think there are ways in which Latinos on the left also mischaracterize Latinos by thinking of them as, I mean, I was on a panel with Matt Barreto, who heads the Latino decisions, or did until it became something else. And his concluding words to me were, Latinos are progressive. Latinos are progressive. And I wanted to say, like, I mean, I think Latino progressives are progressive, but I don't think all Latinos are progressive. And in some ways, I want words like some to become sexy again, but they're not sexy, because when you're talking to reporters, you know, you have to make these firm declarations about Latinos are progressive or they are natural Republicans. So I want to break that down, and sometimes I feel like I'm, or for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she gave an interview with Maria Hinojosa from Latino USA several months ago, where she was talking about how Latino conservatives just don't know their history. And I was thinking like, oh, well, no, I think they know their history. I think the history that they believe about themselves, about their families, the stories they tell about who they are, where they come from, are very much not in alignment with what she believes, but I do think they know their history. So sometimes I feel like I'm trying to push back too much against Latinos on the left who are saying things like Latino conservatives are sellouts or pochos or race traitors. Why do I do that? Well, I think I will say one thing to bring it back to my grandfather, because in all of my conversations with him over the past 40 years, he never, at least in some way, intimated to me that he aspires to be white, is a pocho, is a traitor to his race. I think he could freely admit that in the mines and in the military, he experienced and saw discrimination, but the discrimination he experienced didn't kind of shake his faith in the United States as the country where he was given all of the opportunities he had. I remember so well having a conversation with him after 20 years in the military. He had retired from the military, and he said to me very proudly, like, you know, I've made $250,000 in my lifetime. And he said that very proudly. You know, that was like, you can do the math and realize that $250,000, $250,000 isn't that much over a 20-year period. I know that, what that would be today might be more, but he still said it proudly because he felt like he had served his country. The United States was still the protector of freedom and democracy and all of these things. So I think part of what I wanted to do, for better or worse, is humanize the Latino conservative position in a way that, even if we disagree with it, made it seem understandable from their perspective. Because I do believe that if whatever we consider to be progress in moving the conversation about Latinidad forward, I do think first that we have to kind of see the whole picture clearly before we, kind of then, I want to deconstruct it before I reconstruct it as something meaningful.
Thank you. Yeah. Fascinating talk and so many things to think about. I actually wanted to revisit something that you mentioned that I think it's very insightful and important. I think there is something surprising here in the sense that, the younger generations of Latinos are voting for Trump and the older generations might be rejecting it. And I'm thinking about a comparison with Asian Americans, where Asian Americans, there was a generational conflict with Trump. The older generation, this is from reports, the older generations were still seeing something in Trump, and the younger generations is really democratic and progressive, and we don't. It seems that I was looking at the data, and obviously that's not happening among Latinos. That the younger, and so I wanted to comment more on that. I would think, is this a problem of Latinos, or it connects with the problem of the Democratic Party? That in many senses, a party of the elites, urban elites, or stuff like that. And that message, Latinos are kind of like the white working class and
Yeah, great. I have a lot of ideas. I would like to invite Michael to also weigh in here. I don't know if you have thoughts about Latino youth today and.
Sure. I mean, I think I want to push back against this impression a bit, because I don't think this is quite correct, that Latinos are more conservative than the older generation, which is certainly not true. And are they more conservative than African American youth? Absolutely. More than white youth? Probably not. So again, there's more of a more diversity among young Latinos than is often talked about, but it is still younger voters overall across all racial ethnic categories are more progressive than the older generation, and Latinos are no different. So I just want to push back a little bit.
Yeah, and I hope I didn't mean to suggest that I think Latino youth are more conservative than the,
There is instability.
Yeah. Right. I just mean, and again, I don't know if this has been studied in the political science literature or even reported on yet, but I'm just observing that the people I spoke with, the people who were most questioning their continued loyalty to the Republican Party were the older Latinos, and Trump still managed to increase his support. So some of that increased support must have come from Latino youth, I'm guessing, but I don't know what the numbers are in particular places or among particular groups. So the one thing I'll say is I still have ideas about this, of course, and I think that one thing is that whereas older Latinos have a kind of longer historical perspective and understood what the Republican Party was during the Reagan years or during the George W. Bush years, George H.W. Bush years, I think younger Latinos who recently turned 18 the Republican Party they know is Donald Trump's Republican Party. They don't know another Republican Party. So this just is the Republican Party to them. They don't necessarily have the historical perspective comparing it to Nixon. So what does that mean? I mean, I don't know. There's some sort of like live and let live, although that's super complicated. I'm going to get myself in trouble here because this isn't like, I haven't studied this. I don't know, but these are just theories. There's a kind of bravado and brashness that maybe youth are drawn to also. I also think that Latino youth after 2008 many Latino families were impacted by the Great Recession, and college kids across the board now came out of college in a lot of debt and therefore are open to arguments about a party that's going to help you prosper, And I also think that, I think the Border Patrol must have something to do with this too, where, we know that the Border Patrol is 50% Latino or something like that. And many of those people I'm guessing, are people who we would consider to be youth as well, So they enter these professions that are predominantly, populated by conservatives, like the Border Patrol, Mm-hmm. Right.
So again, this goes back to that thing.
Right. And so that's, I remember the night of the election or after the election, people like Marco Rubio tweeting the Republican Party is becoming the party for working class, multiracial Americans. That's their theory. I do think, and I've been listening to the Latino Vote podcast a lot with Mike Madrid and Chuck Rocha, and both of them, the one's a progressive, one's a Republican, and they both seem to agree that the Democratic Party has kind of abandoned the working class. I mean, historians have talked about this phenomenon since the 1980s of like becoming more and more indebted to the like Silicon Valley donor class, these Atari Democrats, and there's not a natural fit between like that Republican Party and the working class, or Democratic Party and the working class Democratic Party. So I think there is, I would love to hear your perspective on this, but like some consensus that the Democratic Party has moved away from the working class, and that's part of it. But I'm not so comfortable, like Daniel Garza, I remember, he talked about like, oh, you know, you want to understand South Texas, like you have to understand that just rural Texans, their values align more with the values of the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party. So, you know, it is possible that Latinos in South Texas are more like Latinos in the Central Valley of California than they are like Latinos in Houston. And maybe Latinos in Houston and Los Angeles are more like one another than Latinos in Los Angeles and the Central Valley. I mean, that's probably true, but I'm always wary of explanations that rely on some sort of ideas about cultural values. You know, it just seems so slippery.
I have so many thoughts.
Yeah,
so many thoughts about this.
Can we stay till 8 or so? Is that all right? Yeah.
Working class. What does that mean? And the way that journalists use it drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Because what journalists mean by well, I don't even know what the hell they mean by working class, but it's probably non-college educated. So that is a lot of people who are non-college educated, many of whom have pretty high income. So when you talk about white working class, it's particularly problematic. Again, Latino working class, again, the voting data suggests people who have, say, less than $30,000 of income, less than $50,000 of income, those people are voting Democratic. They're not voting Republican.
Yeah.
So what's working class? Has the Democratic Party, I think the Democratic Party lost the working class. I think it's in some ways a kind of silly argument. If you look at policies, the policies certainly haven't abandoned what we would think of as the working class.
Right.
The one thing to think about in thinking about Latinos as actors, political actors, is that in many ways they're like other Americans.
Yeah. Totally.
They're not separate. They're part of this. They're part of the same political streams. So the rural-urban divide that you alluded to plays out for Latinos
Everywhere.
as it does for whites. Yeah. You mentioned the last part of your book was about loyalty, and partisan loyalty is a huge part of the story of American politics since the mid-1990s. You know, people talk about Latinos as an identity. Party is a huge identity now. If you ask, and this is one of my favorite things, like who you want to room with, people say, I'll room with someone who listens to different music, you know, gets up early in the morning. People will tolerate a lot of things, but they won't tolerate someone who's from a different party. Like they would rather, you know, someone who doesn't flush the toilet than somebody who's a Republican. I mean, it's like there's a fundamental identity. Politics has become a fundamental identity, and it's true for Latinos too. I have a work under review where we did a survey experiment where we tried to prime people to remind them about how awful Trump had been about immigration. It doesn't move people. It didn't move people. The only people, it didn't move Republicans at all. Like they were like, yep, we know that, and we're going to keep voting Republican. Democrats, of course, were already voting for Biden, and the only people that moved were people who were a little bit uncertain about Biden, were leaning Democratic. Those people that moved a little bit toward the Democratic Party. Otherwise, didn't move anybody. So, you know, part of the story about Latino conservatives is to say there are, you know, in many ways,
just like American conservatives.
Part of this American story.
I think that's basically true. I mean, the things that I think about to supplement that story are that, like, you know, Latino voters probably know who Juan Guaido is. It's more likely that they would know who Guaido is, or Nicolas Maduro, or AMLO, or something. They're probably more tuned in to US Latin American politics than other groups of conservative voters. Maybe they're more tuned into, you know, what I guess I'm inclined to say they on average care more maybe about issues like charter schools or bilingual education, because, you know, the fastest growth of charter schools is like African American and Latino students, and they're particularly popular in places like Milwaukee or Florida or South Texas, you know. So maybe those are issues, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, but to me, if they are basically like other groups of American conservatives at the same time, that they might be motivated more by like, or understand more, care more about issues like US Latin American relations, that to me only underscores what we have always known about Latinos, this idea about like ni de aquí, ni de allá, you know, like we're both Americans and not. We are both from here and have our attention focused elsewhere too, you know. So I don't, that to me just feels also like a very old debate about who Latinos are. Yeah.
I think we have time for one last question over here, and then we can have some more questions.
Have we met before? You look very familiar.
You do too. We will talk after.
Maybe.
My name's Emmanuel Martinez. Thank you so much for your time. You had mentioned cultural values and you mentioned bilingual education. So I wanted to bring those to the table here, thinking about the history of Latino conservatism. I was curious to see, like, in your research, sort of what role does Spanish language retention or English language acquisition play? Because I'm thinking about the 1970s, 1980s, and the call for, you know, English only, a la Richard Rodriguez. And yet at the same time, I'm thinking about now, and, you know, within the Conservative Party and its connections to business and corporation, calls for the Latino market, and thinking about Latina small business owners, right? And so I'm seeing in some ways kind of a call for bilingualism, or at least an accommodation therein. So in kind of thinking about the evolution or development of the Latino conservative, what have you seen in terms of the role of language?
I think it's super interesting. I think that, have you read Rosina Lozano's book, An American Language, about, it's like the history of Spanish in the United States? It's a really good book. It doesn't talk about it in partisan terms. There's also a book by a guy named John Screntny, is it called The Minority Rights Revolution or something like that? That has a chapter on bilingual education. But yeah, there are different things going on. I mean, historically, Republicans used bilingual education as a way of cleaving Mexican American and African American voters, because African American voters, by and large, supported busing. Latino families did not support busing because they wanted to be able to send their kids to neighborhood schools where they could learn bilingual education. They could continue to speak Spanish and English. So I think the issue of language there has been used by the Republican Party to kind of drive a wedge between Latinos and African Americans. But then you also have, like, you know, you talked about US English. It's this group started, it was a kind of spin-off of the John Tanton Federation for American Immigration Reform, founded by a guy who explicitly supported eugenic ideas. And, US English was a spin-off. It was founded also, or the first head of it was a guy named S.I. Hayakawa, a Japanese American who wanted, the group, what they were trying to do was pass a constitutional amendment to make English the official language of the United States. But after S.I. Hayakawa, the next president was Linda Chavez, this Mexican American who claims to be the first, I would love to find this out if this is true, but claims to be the first Mexican American to offer a Latino literature course at UCLA, because she had gone to get her PhD at CU Boulder and then was adjuncting at UCLA, then worked in the Nixon administration. But yeah, super. I mean, she wrote a book called, there's a whole like literature by Latino conservatives that I think is really interesting. You should read her books. One is called Out of the Barrio. There's a chapter in there about language. She also wrote another book called An Unlikely Conservative, or How I Became the Most Hated Mexican American in the United States, something like that. And she details all of this. I mean, you'll get a very clear picture of like the Latina conservative self-conception there. And, you know, these people, you mentioned Richard Rodriguez, I mean, they just believe that, you know, the path to success in the United States is learning English. And the way Richard Rodriguez describes it is that, you know, English was the public-facing language and Spanish was the language of the home, but the way to get ahead was to learn English. And what's interesting is I teach this summer bridge course at Northwestern, and there were a lot of Latinos this year who, I mean, they describe the same thing. They're very uncomfortable with their Spanish because their parents wanted them to get ahead by focusing on English. And I think that idea, actually, it transcends partisanship, I think. You know, that's just something that Latino families, many, and then, you know, it's a kind of typical experience where Latinos in their 20s and 30s then want to reconnect with their language, you know. So I think there are parts of the language issue that have partisan implications and parts that transcend that.
Thank you.
And so we're out of time, but we'll be here for a little bit longer if you'd like to come up with a question more informally. But thank you all for coming. Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you.